The talent acquisition business is how you compete for national championships. And this week, we have gotten our refresh update of the blue chip ratio. For those who are not familiar, the blue chip ratio, as it was originally formulated by Bud Elliott a long time. Are we more than a decade into this, Bud?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah. Long time ago. Now, the idea that your accumulation of having more than 50% of blue chips, 4 stars and 5 stars, than the rest of your roster over a 4-year span, that is how you're going to be able to put together a national championship winning roster. So if you go to 247sports.com, you can find the full blue chip ratio for 2023, 16 teams who meet the threshold for winning a national championship. I'll go ahead and run through. Here's what we've got so far for this year's blue chip ratio. Tom, any guess at who's at number 1, no peeking?
Alabama?
90%. I swear every year those daggum long snappers keeping the Crimson Tide from being able to go and get 100% on this. Ohio State right on their heels at 85, Georgia at 77, Texas A&M at 73%, Clemson at 72, LSU at 71, and then Texas and Oklahoma both at 70%. Again, you can go to check out the full list. But as you were putting all this together, what were some of the movers and shit? Like, what were some of the movement that you saw? Because I know you always look at this from a year-over-year perspective.
Yeah, so welcome back, USC. Thankfully, I would have been pretty nervous if Caleb Williams with a roster in the high 40%, which is where they would have been if they had not added a few more elite players on signing day. I would have been kind of nervous that he would bust it. I always think this will, potentially get busted by like a guy like Deshaun, who almost did it when Saban did that onside kick. Clemson was like a 49% team that year. That Oregon team with Mariota that eventually lost to Ohio State in the first ever college football playoff, they almost busted it. So I was a little worried about USC, but ran the numbers. They hit it. Somewhat surprised that Auburn stayed on, but they're just, barely hanging on. And I've done a bunch of radio and I'm sick, guys. So sorry about the voice today. I'd probably skip it if it wasn't blue chip ratio day, since Jordan did such a good job of drafting my quarterback team. Team BJ.
Let's go.
Look, this is not a who's most likely to win the national title list. It does not measure coaching, culture, retention, player development, schedule draw. It doesn't say anything really about your ability to make the playoff. This is purely who has recruited well enough over the past 4 years, like done the bare minimum in recruiting that history says it takes to win a national title. So, from that standpoint, a little surprised about Auburn. No, I'm not saying that Florida or Miami have legitimate shots to win the national title this year. I think they probably need to do a little bit better in like the retention, coaching, culture thing over the last 4 years, not blaming the new staffs. The number of teams that are 70% or higher has never been higher. So people are all like, oh, wow, like Bama, Georgia, Ohio State, look at those numbers. And agree, they're super high. Bama's the first 90% team ever. But the number of teams that are in the 70s is also up quite a bit. We've never had we've never had 7 teams in the 70s. I think we never had more than 3. So like that's pretty impressive. Also, like kind of down ballot, the lack of teams in the 30s, right? So people are like, oh, there's just 3 super teams. I don't really agree. I think we are seeing a bit of a separation between like the top 20 in the sport and everybody else. Like Virginia Tech and schools like Wisconsin and stuff like that, they're way down from where they used to be, 5-10 years ago.
Texas A&M, 73% of that top group. Like you get Texas underachieved, certainly, 5-7 in Sark's first season, but of the 70% group over the last 4 years, Alabama, you got it. Ohio State, Georgia, Clemson, even with winning conference titles, LSU got to the SEC championship game. Oklahoma, not that far removed from being at the top of the Big 12. Texas A&M at 73% is like, how much longer is that hanging on that you see? Like, is that going to continue to be up there above 70% next year? The year after that, is there some maintenance that needs to be done there in College Station?
Not a measure of culture, coaching, or attrition retention. I think it really, really strongly applies to Texas A&M. I have to think they'll be better. That they are sort of this team. It's like if they put it all together, they're really scary. The if is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Clearly, like they missed a bowl game last year, right? The culture that Jimbo brought is obviously terrible, or was. Maybe he'll change it around, this year. It looks pretty close to what they had culture wise at the end of the time in Tallahassee. So, yeah, I think they are one that people will circle. And just having this doesn't mean that you will be good. If you're that high and you're missing bowl games, I do think that's a cause for concern. I don't think that's hating on Texas A&M to say if you have a 73% blue chip ratio, missing bowls should not be on the table.
So there are more 70% teams than ever. Am I to believe that the era of NIL and college football playoff is not leading to more parity? The old saying, the rich get poorer, isn't true?
I think that's generally true. And see, my thing is, I think it's pretty much always been that there's not that many teams that can actually win the title. When I started this, I felt like I was more data heavy than most of like the college football media, right? It was very like narrative story based. And I was at these recruiting camps and I would see people hype like Wisconsin and like the old TCU teams and Michigan State and teams like that for the national title. And I'm like, will you guys go to one recruiting camp with me and just see the quality of player that like a Bama signs or a Florida State or a USC? Guys, it's not the same thing. Like they're not the same quality of player. That's really why I started this. Like who's actually recruited well enough to do this thing? Now, like even the people who hate data in the media are not promoting teams outside this list for the most part to win it, at least not on an annual basis. They're like, oh, can Wisconsin take the step? No, now we know like Wisconsin beats up on a lesser division of the Big Ten, doesn't really recruit the high level player quite as much, stuff like that, right? So I think we are seeing more teams that are definitely more talented. The big gap is like the gap between like 18 and 30 is massive now.
I also think too, it's interesting. And I thought the last 2 years have proved, what you're talking about. This isn't just to get to the playoff. That's a whole nother conversation with TCU and Cincinnati. But then you see with TCU, the glaring difference in how bad it could be between Georgia and their stacked roster and what a TCU looks like with a good roster, but not anywhere close to the type of talent that's there. Where I'm surprised Bama's that high and Georgia's in third. I thought Georgia, considering their past cycles, would have been higher than this. And I also think it puts, I think it's because I have doubted the length of this Bama dynasty. Is it coming to a close? Is there dominance? And I think positionally it does matter. They have massive question marks, coordinators leaving. But this one's like, man, maybe they really aren't going anywhere.
To that point, Georgia was at 77% the last 2 seasons and also won the title. So it has not hurt them. And I look at this as sort of like a necessary but not sufficient thing. Like not like obviously 90%, you'd rather be 90% than 51%. Okay, clearly. I do just think it's kind of a general minimum level of talent to get over. And then the rest of the stuff matters quite a bit. Coaching, culture, scheme, quarterback matters an absolute ton in this. I think you have more leeway to win with a lesser quarterback. If you have ridiculous talent around, that's probably just the tautology. But Bama signed the best class of all time last year by the numbers. A&M did it 2 years ago. Georgia, I don't know that they will do it, but they will have a shot to do it. And if so, then they're going to jump up, pretty hard, obviously.
With this recruiting class currently?
Yes. With the one they're building?
Okay, so speaking of the ones that are building, this is one of my favorite aspects of the blue chip ratio is being able to see who are the programs that are on the rise, what programs are just 1 or 2 recruiting classes away from being able to have that. And a lot of times we see this with new coaching staffs, right? There's a big exodus of talent. Maybe it takes a year or 2 to get your feet under you. I want to say, like, is Tennessee close?
Tennessee is really close. Tennessee is a good class away. Florida State is a great class away. Washington is like an unbelievable class away. South Carolina is probably 2 of their best classes they've ever had away.
I would not bet on that.
I'd not have guessed South Carolina, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And obviously, like, that's going to be tough to make. I mean, their win total 6.5. If you guys listen to the summer school, don't know if they hit that. We'll see. But they are recruiting well. They're recruiting better under Beamer, I think.
And one last thing, and you addressed this in the piece, but you 2 years ago, I think, started to address, what you were going to do with transfers. This year, you've actually taken the next step to show what the rating is, not including transfers. And then when transfers, using the 24/7 Sports transfer ratings, how that is updated. I found it interesting that of all the 16 teams, that when you factor in the transfer situation, 14 of them actually have their percentage go down. One stays the same. That is Georgia. One goes slightly up. Michigan goes from a 54% to a 55%. What do you attribute that to, at least in terms of, why a transfer adjustment based on the current roster would have the blue chip ratio adjusted?
I think it's because, for the most part, transfers remain players that are somewhere, but like transfers that these schools are taking remain players that are somewhere between like average at the worst to elite at the best. But the curve is much more on the average to above average. We're taking this guy because we need some depth. We're taking this guy because we believe, he can come and be a quality player for us. You're not seeing a lot of transfers, and especially not at the premium positions, get drafted really highly. So, there are 4-star transfers. There are, I think, 3 5-star transfers this year. Schools do a pretty good job. The schools with resources, at least, who initially signed these studs out of high school, they do a pretty good job of locking them up, right? There's a couple chances, like Jordan Birch from South Carolina to Oregon. That was a surprise. Like, that was a 5-star coming out of high school. He played fairly well for them, a little up and down. Oregon got him. Like, that's kind of an outlier. There's not a ton of that absent a coaching change. Caleb Williams, USC, obviously is one there. So again, like, the players who end up being really, really elite, for the most part, sign out of high school and are NIL'd immediately once they show some positive signs on campus and don't hit the portal. Sometimes they get big time NIL'd once on campus if they show a little thing and they're a backup, right? So,
I would guess too that a player maybe didn't live up to the hype, or didn't live up to the expectations, so he's not getting playing time, so he leaves. So, if you did have a great 4 or 5-star that was there, he leaves. And on the flip side, if there's a player that they're plucking from a group of 5 school or lesser known that's a 3-star who's been balling out, you add him to your roster, that doesn't count as a 4 or 5-star, correct? So you might have a better player, but the rating doesn't go
Use
up.
the transfer
rating. I do use the new transfer ratings. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So like, I think it does say something. Even using the new transfer ratings, we have almost 250, 247 4-star players this year, somewhere around that range. Most of these teams are still going down slightly. Now, outside of this, Florida State and Ole Miss went up. FSU went from 38 to 41. Ole Miss went up, I think, 4%. So, like, there are some teams that are like heavy transfer teams that have gone up some.
Notre Dame fans love the Cover 3 podcast. 55 to 62 to 65. They've been telling us, Bud. They've been telling us that Marcus Freeman. It's a new era in South Bend, different levels of talent, and that does surely seem to be the trajectory.